The plenary speaker is Hal Varian, who is the chief economist at Google. And this year we actually also have discussants for the plenary talk. So we have Jonathan Hull, who's the chief economist at Uber, who will be the discussant after Hal's talk. I think just one comment I wanted to make is that one of the things Nicole and I were thinking about when we put the plenary sessions together is that we wanted to try to bring topics to the table that we felt the EC community should certainly be, at the minimum, engaging with, but also had the potential to influence through the types of things that we do. So that's the goal here. And then tomorrow's session is on data markets, which has a very similar role to play. So Hal, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and speak before this group. I was asked to look into this topic of the future of work a few years ago because Google was trying to figure out what was involved, and I came up with a few interesting ideas, I hope. So I want to run by them and show you my views here. So there's a very pretentious title to this paper. That's Automation and Procreation. But I decided that was much too pretentious, and so now I've renamed it Bots and Tots. So what I want to talk about is basically the interaction between robotics or automation and demographics, which is really quite important because an economist, we always like to look at both sides of the market, the demand side and the supply side. So in its simplest Econ 1 form, there's a supply of labor. There's a demand for labor that determines the level of employment and the wage rate. And if something perturbs that model, so maybe technology comes along, that might shift the demand curve inward. You need fewer people to get a particular job done. But what people forget is that there's a supply shift that goes on as well, typically. That is, there's going to be a reduction in supply because of aging. If you look at most of the developed economies in the world, I'll show you some charts and graphs in a few minutes, they're rapidly getting older. And what that means is people retire from leave the labor force, then you're having a reduction in supply of labor as well. And what the outcome depends on is really which curve shifts the most. Are you going to be a big shift in supply that sort of swamps the demand change or vice versa? And I will answer that question. I'll give you an answer by the end of the talk. So supply, that's the tot side. Demand, that's the bot side. I want to talk about bots first. And we've all seen the stories in the newspaper about robots taking our jobs, right? That's a very common theme. It was a theme in 2016. It was a theme in 1980. It's a theme in 1960, 1935. And in fact, we can go all the way back to 1812 and probably further if we had the document. So this has been around a long time, the fear that robots will take our jobs in some way and make us worse off. But I have a more optimistic view of that. Lately, we've been seeing this news stories on America's growing labor shortage. There are shortages of workers in all sorts of occupations, blue collar and white collar jobs, construction, agriculture, truck drivers, forklift drivers, dairy farms, meat packing, on and on and on. There's demand for a lot of low-skilled jobs. And when you look at what happens in the labor market, you're seeing the demand at the low end go up, you're seeing the demand at the high end go up. It's the demand in the middle that's sort of the most sluggish. In the 20th century, the century that we grew up in, many of us, there were two big shocks to the labor market, and then a few small ones. So the big ones were, one, the baby boomers. So the baby boomers, look at this chart, the baby dearth in the 30s during the Depression. You had World War II come along. There was, again, some pent-up demand there. And then you had this huge surge in the baby booms from 1946 to 1964, kind of a 20-year period where you saw dramatic growth in that particular segment of the population. After that, there was the baby bust. They had enough babies, they went back to normal. And then we saw the echo of the baby boom. That's when the babies from the baby boomers became 20 years old, 22 years old, got married, starting to have their own kids, and then since then it's slacked off. Now, the reverse side of that, we're on the other side of this pig in the python, it's sometimes called, because we're seeing a situation now where all those baby boomers are retiring, okay? And that's going to have a big impact on the labor force. The second demographic effect, which was really huge, was women entering the paid labor force. I want to emphasize the paid because, of course, there's always been unpaid work in the domestic environment. The people who founded GDP, who came up with the concept of GDP, said the biggest problem with GDP is it ignores domestic production inside the household. But as we got more automation at the household level, things like washing machines and dryers and dishwashers and vacuum cleaners and all those domestic appliances, that freed up labor, in fact, to join the paid labor force, and that was quite a big effect where we saw this happening there. And that, of course, is pretty much leveled off by now, and of course, men and women are both getting older at the same rate, and so we're seeing the withdrawal of this labor supply in current times. I said there were lots of little ones. I put a couple charts here that I think are interesting. The spreadsheet apocalypse, where you saw the demand for bookkeepers, accounting, and auditing clerks falling. But at the same time, you saw the demand for management analysts, financial managers, accountants, and so on going up because the impact of spreadsheets had these two different effects, reducing the demand for bookkeepers, but increasing the demand for analysts. This is my favorite chart. Believe it or not, the BLS still tracks video rental clerks. And there was a period where, of course, we had a big increase in this job category, and then since then it went way down. There's hardly anybody left to count anymore. Now, when economists look at this idea of jobs, robots stealing my jobs, we refine that a bit. The idea is you want to talk not about jobs per se, but about tasks. So you think of a job as being comprised of a number of tasks. Automation's generally eliminated the dull, tedious, and repetitive tasks. I already mentioned the household, domestic appliances, washing clothes, drying dishes, mowing lawns, and so on, but also cognitive tasks like making change for purchases, memorizing maps so you could drive around town, adding up columns of numbers. Those are all gone. I like to say computers have already taken one important task away from us: square roots. When I was a kid, this probably shows my age, but when I was a kid, we actually had to learn how to take square roots by hand, and it was this rather painful process you might know about. I bet 99.999% of the square roots that are calculated are done by computers these days. All right, so if you eliminate all the tasks associated with a job, then you've eliminated the job, but that's pretty rare. In fact, Jim Besson at BU looked at the 1950 census. They had 270 detailed occupations listed, so you could fill in what your occupation was. And he says that only one of those has been eliminated due to automation. So what was that? Huh? Elevator operator. And there he is, happy elevator operator. There are a few left around. Every now and then you'll find an old elevator, but they're there kind of for nostalgia reasons. But even the elevator operator had other tasks. It wasn't just moving the elevator around. It was being a safety monitor, checking out the elevator because he was working in it. A security monitor, checks who comes in and out of the building. A greeter who said hello, providing answers to questions, providing services to residents, delivering Amazon boxes, whatever. The elevator operator had all sorts of other tasks. And those didn't disappear. They were just folded in other jobs. So now when you go into a skyscraper, used to be, there'd be these elevator operators you'd talk to. Now there's a security person, maybe there's a receptionist, maybe there's a scheduler. There might be somebody who's tidying up, all sorts of different things. These were things that the elevator operator previously did, these tasks, and now they've been moved over into different jobs. And in fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has this really fantastic site called ONET. And what ONET is it looks at all the job classifications. I think there's about 1,500 of them. And then it looks at all the tasks that are associated with those jobs. And if you take a job, which we think of as a relatively low-paying, non-skilled job, of being a groundskeeper, or a gardener, what do? Well, they do lots of different things. They use hand tools such as shovels, rakes, pruning saws, and so on. They operate vehicles, they water lawns, they do all this stuff. There's usually about 35 of these tasks for each job, and you can look up different jobs. Look up computer engineer, for example, and you'll see survey data where they surveyed people who referred to themselves as computer engineers and looked at the tasks they had to do. And it goes on. So and it goes on another slide, but by now I think you've got the idea. Could you build a robotic groundskeeper? Well, yeah, probably. Give me $1 billion in 10 years and I'll come up with one that does one or two of those tasks. But if you've got 35 or 40 tasks, can you do that with a single device? And I would say maybe you could, but it wouldn't be worth it doing it because it's not something that would really make a lot of economic sense. And automating all of those jobs, all of those tasks, would be very challenging. And in fact, if you think about it, if you look at robots, they work best when you have a standardized environment. So take the classic example of an assembly line. If you look at an assembly line, we've been spending 100 years, essentially, since 1909 or so, making a standardized environment where you had one worker at one station doing one task. And once you've got that all working smoothly, then you could move the person out and move an industrial robot in. And in fact, fully half of all the industrial robots are in auto factories, and the next 30% are in consumer electronics assembly. So using this kind of mechanization or automation to do assembly is pretty common. So heterogeneous environments make it much, much, much more difficult. So there's the ideal environment for a robot gardener, right? They only have to keep the lawn mowed. That's pretty much it. Or if you look at another environment, like a hotel housekeeper, if you think about all the different tasks that person does in all these different rooms and all these different hotels everywhere in the world, there's a huge challenge in terms of automating all those tasks. That is, automating away the entire job. Very, very unlikely. On the other hand, you could make it a lot easier to do some of those tasks than it is now, because you could build labor-saving devices that would help you accomplish that. And I have one other example here. Well, there's the ideal environment for a housekeeper robot. It's a Japan pod hotel. I grew up in an orchard. It was called Varian's Orchard, not surprisingly. And we had an orchard that looked very much like this slide on the left, where you had apple trees standing alone. You had to get a ladder. You carried a bag. You went up and picked the apples, all that stuff. But orchards have totally changed in the last 50 years. There's an orchard on the right where the trees can only be 6 feet tall. They're esplanaded on one side of a platform, so the apples only grow on one side of the tree. And what that does is it makes it much easier for humans to farm those trees and to take care of them and manage them. There's a picture on the left of pruning. But now that you've standardized the environment sufficiently, you can actually go in and harvest those by machine. So if you think about it, there's some products, agricultural products, that have been automated for a long time, like harvesting wheat and corn and soybeans and so on. But then if you look at all the soft fruits, apples, peaches, plums, pears, strawberries, raspberries, cherries, etc., it's still quite a challenge to do it. They're making progress, obviously. You can see the progress that's being made, but it's still something that's fairly difficult to do because the entire environment has not been fully standardized. One theme that goes, not among professionals, but one theme that goes around in sort of columnists and so on is humanoid robots. And if you think about this first invasion of the labor-saving devices I referred to earlier, 1880s, 1890s, none of those perform their action the way a human does. Because washing machines, humans scrub like this, and the washing machine does this, and the dryers do something different, and the dishwashers do something different, the vacuum cleaners. Problem was, trying to develop a human that would use all those human tools would be kind of a foolish thing to do. It's like the difference between a person vacuuming and what a Roomba does. It's a completely different story. And it's true in all of nature. We spent thousands of years trying to build flying machines, and the whole idea was to get something that flapped its wings. Well, that was the wrong approach. That didn't work. Same thing with cars. They don't move the same way people do, and so on. I guess there are some exceptions to that, but very rare. This is a nice little chart about routine and non-routine work, and it goes back to what I was just saying. If you look at non-routine cognitive work, kind of what we do, you can see that's really going up in terms of the employment prospects. But if you look at non-routine manual work that a skilled manual laborer does, that's also going up. The ones that are flattening out are the ones where it's routine cognitive, like doing arithmetic calculations with a pen and paper, or routine manual, which would be doing something like the assembly line work I described earlier. So the non-routine part is really critical, because if you can routinize something, if you make it simple enough, then you have a machine do it. So that brings me to autonomous vehicles. So we would have autonomous vehicles now if it weren't for those darned humans, right? That's the problem. If you think about it, suppose we had an autonomous vehicle driving through Phoenix or Chandler, as a case in point, or San Francisco. If it was the only car on the road, no problem. In fact, we've had driverless tractors for at least a decade, because the tractors are working in a very controlled environment, a particular field. Same thing with driverless cars. And then when you put the humans in there, well, the cars have to predict the humans. The humans add a lot of randomness, and when they add all this randomness, it gets much harder to do than it was with just the homogeneous environment. So that's a very critical aspect of this. Henry Ford in 1929 said, "In mass production, there are no fitters." So we don't even know what that means now. What it means is back in 1909 and that period when they're working the assembly line, a fitter was a person who had a part and a file, and he filed the part down so it would fit into the device that he was constructing. And fitters were in every assembly operation. But luckily for history, by the 1920s, we actually were able to produce standardized parts, which were pretty darn well standardized. And you had to have a standardized part if you're going to do an assembly line, because otherwise you'd have to keep stopping the assembly line or having backup people who were doing the fitting for all those parts. And in fact, here's this nice quote from Elon Musk, who said, "Excessive automation at Tesla was a mistake, to be precise, my mistake. Humans are underrated." I love that. I want to make t-shirts that say, "Humans are underrated, Elon Musk's." So you can look at other examples too. A lot of this stuff at their plant, and as people have described, there's some things that we're just not quite standardized enough. It's not so much the problem with the robots, it's the problem with the parts are not always as standardized as you'd like them to be. So you can run into problems that disrupt the production. Heterogeneity is still a problem, even today. Now, of course, when you look at this tasks and jobs distinction, then the obvious thing you want to say is, well, what tasks can be automated? How will tasks associated with jobs change? And so on and so on. So there's a whole little industry where people go look at this ONET stuff, the data I was describing, the tasks associated with jobs, try to break those tasks down and to understand which tasks can be automated, and then by extension, what will happen to the jobs. Because some of the tasks will just move to different jobs, of course, just the way it happened with the elevator operator. There's an MIT Technology Review has a little meta study of this, and so you can see these, I don't know, how many are there, 15 or 20 different studies have been done of this, and they've kind of run into decreasing returns, in my view. If you look at the 10 largest occupations in the US, this is really a kind of amazing slide. There are the 10 occupations on the top: retail, salesperson, cashier, food preparation, and so on. That's 21% of total employment in the US. 21%, fifth, it's amazing. And all those jobs are in services. And that's not too surprising either, because 80% of the labor force is engaged in services. Not producing things, but producing services for people who want want to buy those services, essentially. The most well-paid job out of that top 10 is a registered nurse, and the least well-paid is basically food preparation. So there's about $20,000 a year for food prep, and about $70,000 or more. It's going up because there's shortages of nurses. Most of those jobs I would say, have tasks in them that are too difficult for robots, but we are making progress, people are making progress in automating those tasks. Hasn't got to the point where we've eliminated the entire job, think back to the elevator operator, but you're shifting tasks around because of this automation capabilities. I'm going to just deviate a little bit here and talk about the work week for a minute, as I think I have an interesting perspective on it. If automation increased productivity, output per worker by 25%, then we could accomplish in 4 days what we now takes 5 days to do. And you could consume that extra leisure maybe on a day-by-day basis. So instead of an 8-hour day, you have a 6-hour day, or you do it on a week-by-week basis. You have a 4-day work week. You do it by a lifetime basis where people retire much earlier. There's lots of ways you could use that extra leisure. And if you look at the work week over time, back in 1800s, it was common to see a 70-hour work week. After all, the cows didn't know it was Sunday. They still wanted the services that they needed. And gradually, the work weeks come down to, in the US, about 38.5 hours a week. But there's huge variation across countries. So here I took OECD countries, and there's the US. Mexico has a 45-hour work week, and the Netherlands, to my amazement, has a 29-hour work week. 29-hour work week, a whole day less than the work week we have. And the reason they have that is they have a very deliberate policy towards flexible work, and the consequence of that is you end up with basically 4-day work weeks, but many members of all the members of the family are participate in that, so it'll be common to see, for example, a man work from Monday through Thursday and a woman work Tuesday through Friday, and so they've got each a 4-day work week, but a very high participation rate, which is a kind of interesting model. And I think we hear this all the time. What people want is more jobs and less work. That's another t-shirt that I want to make. And I think that's exactly what technology can deliver. Some people say, universal basic income, I love it. Some people say, I hate it. But you know what? Everybody loves a 3-day weekend, right? One's coming up next week, and I'll bet you many people are looking forward to it. Everybody loves them. So make them permanent. Why not? If you became 25% more productive, because then in 4 days you could produce what previously took you 5 days to produce. And of course, you'd have to think about the labor market participation as well. I'm going to get into that in a minute when I talk about demography. All right, I'm not denying that there will be significant disruptions as we move into this new future. I think wages will definitely be going up for unskilled work and for skilled work, even more so. Education and training would be necessary, but there's a bit of a fallacy, what we call the fallacy of composition for education. It's good for any given individual to become more educated and get a higher wage for doing that, but who does the jobs that don't require the education? Those jobs will still be done. They're not going to be entirely automated away in many cases because of the heterogeneity in the environments, as I referred to before. So groundskeepers and hotel maids and all these other stuff, they'll still be there. And the question is, how do you handle the automation and training for workers, even in jobs that don't require a whole lot of training? Can technology help deliver on the job skills? I claim it already does it. There are 1 billion views per day, 1 billion views per day of how-to videos on YouTube. And some of that stuff is cognitive, so you can learn some computer science on YouTube, you learn some mathematics on YouTube, simple stuff or more complicated stuff. But some of it is manual. I'm sure that most people in this audience have gone to YouTube to learn how to fix something or change something or replace something, how to sweat copper pipe. I don't know what sweating a pipe means, how to weld cast iron, how to remove a strip bolt, all this different stuff, and you can go to YouTube and find how to do almost anything. Maybe it's artistic, maybe it's manual labor, maybe it's cognitive labor, whatever. cognitive skills, I should have said, and manual skills. So it used to be, you think about it, a cashier, you had to know how to make change. Well, no cashiers know how to make change. Today, it's all the machine tells them what to do. You had to be a writer, you had to know how to spell. Thank God that's gone. Being a taxi driver, you had to know how to navigate city streets. Well, Uber's solved that problem. If you worked in an international hotel, you might have to know a little foreign language, but now we all have Google Translate, and that's not a demand. Recognizing plants, recognizing dogs. I mean, that's, of course, a solved problem. But it used to be to work in a kennel or to work for a veterinarian, you had to learn these breeds of dogs, but now it's kind of done for you. And you will learn them in the sense that, yeah, you'll use your phone to figure out, oh, that's a labradoodle, but then eventually you'll make the identification yourself. And, we always think about taking the worker and the employer and bringing the skills up to what the employer needs, but lots of times you can take the job and de-skill it in the sense of moving it down to something where the computer plus the human can actually perform the job much better. How are we doing on time there? 8 minutes, that'll work, okay. All right, so this is my summary slide. I'm not gonna go through that. I'm gonna turn to the next point, which is TOTS. Productivity, the way economists define it, is output per hour. And if you look at output per person, kind of like GDP per person, that's output per hour times hours per worker times workers per person, okay? Fun, little simple identity, and they're known as productivity times employment times participation. So what's happened? Employment now, for all intents and purposes, we're essentially at full employment, I would say. Participation, that's declining because of the aging population and retirees are moving out of the labor force. And productivity growth has not been as great as we'd like, although that is the magic key that could make everything work out if we could just accelerate that productivity growth. And if you look at cumulative total factor productivity growth, it looks like this. Those gray bars are recessions. You had this period where it was growing at a modest rate. During the 1990s, it accelerated significantly, but then it came back to growing at this relatively modest rate. So, the key to productivity is, of course, having better automation, having better ways for workers to produce things. When you look at the growth of the labor force, this is a kind of a scary graph. It shows you how the labor force is growing by different decades, and of course, they're projecting into the future. The truth is that demography is the only social science where you can really predict what's going to happen 10 or 20 or even 30 years ahead. And we have no idea what's going to happen in technology 20 or 30 years ahead. But you have a pretty good idea of what's happening to the labor force. 2020s, this next decade, is going to be the slowest growth of the labor force ever, okay? And then 2030s, 2040, roughly the same amount, a very slow growth of labor force compared to what it was back in 1970 when all those baby boomers came onto the labor market. So in fact, through most of the 20th century, or at least through the last half of the 20th century, it's been pretty easy to get workers because you had all these baby boomers moving into the labor market, you had a lot of women moving into the labor market, and it wasn't so hard to find people who could work on these various tasks. But it will be much more difficult during the next 25, 35 years, all right? Just because of the demography. And if you look at the growth, there's our old friend showing you what the birth rate was, or what live births were over that period of time. And down here, we've got the growth of the population on the left. We have the growth of the labor force on the right, and the labor force is growing at half the rate of the population growth, okay? If it were for immigration, the labor force would strictly be decreasing in the US. And of course, in many countries, the labor force is decreasing. Oh, by the way, there's the labor force participation rates. That's again, the aging of the population with both men and women retiring. This is a little picture about where the problem will be the worst, and the answer is in the north part of the US. If you look at Texas, Nevada, Utah, their aging population is, they're not aging nearly as rapidly as what happens when you look at the upper Midwest and New England. And we're in good shape compared to other countries. So there's the OECD average. What's being plotted here is a dependency rate. That's the number of people over 65 for every 100 people of working age. So how many non-working retired people does a worker have to support? So if it was 60%, just to pick a number, I have to produce enough stuff for me, and I have to produce enough stuff for those people who aren't working as well, because they're retired or maybe they're young, not in the labor force yet, and so on. So you look at this, Japan is a very difficult situation, Spain, Korea, Italy, Germany, all the places there. US is actually in a better situation than most. We've already seen the US is going to experience fairly large changes to its labor force as well. But if you look in much of Asia and much of Europe, you see a much worse situation. And of course, China is one of the most difficult cases of all, because the one-child policy wreaked havoc with their demographics, and you're seeing the labor force is shrinking now, and it's going to be shrinking at a faster rate as time goes on over the next couple decades. So they're really forced to automate heavily and to invest in AI heavily, because they have this dramatically shrinking labor force. So if you don't make workers more productive, you have a hard time maintaining your standard of living. Oh yeah, here's the picture of China with the great leap forward back there in the 60s, and then you have the one-child policy, and now they're changing. But you know what? No matter how productive you are, it takes 20 years to make a 20-year-old. So you can't speed it up. I guess maybe child labor would be one way, but we're not going to go there. All right, and the U.S. birth rate, so talking about producing workers 20 years from now, the birth rate is an all-time low. It's never been this low before. Usually when there's a recession, the birth rate goes down, recession ends, birth rate goes back up, but not in this case, it didn't come back up. And you're seeing that in other countries too that were hard hit by the recession. Once it goes down, previously it'd always come back, but not anymore. So you're not going to get anything from that particular dimension. And why is this so low? I'm going to skip this. It was just an interesting slide. Basically, it's all economic reasons. That people are worried about the economics, the economy, they can't afford more children, financial instability, et cetera, et cetera. Now that, if we continue to have prosperous growth, that will presumably dampen out, but there's no guarantee of that. So the countries with the bad demographics are the ones that are investing the most in robots. So look at South Korea, Japan, Germany, Italy. All those countries have bad demographics, and so they're trying to make their workforce more productive by using more machines. Almost done, 1 minute. And there's a little picture of the supply of industrial robots where you see this huge investment by China. And this is just another chart that shows the same thing. All right, so I promised you that I would tell you which was the bigger effect, the shifting demand curve or the shifting supply curve. So here's a back of the envelope calculation. Boston Consulting Group said in their aggressive scenario, employment population ratio will decline by 1.76 in the next decade. Bureau of Labor Statistics looked at demography. They said the employment to population ratio will decline by 2.7% based on demography. So the demographic effect over the next 20 years is substantially bigger, 53% bigger than the automation effect. So that's kind of the high point of the talk. Obviously, this is very back of the envelope, rough and ready, but anybody who's going out and doing projections about how innovation will affect the demand for labor, my message is look at the supply, because you don't want to say everything else being equal. You want to say what will the actual labor force look like at these dates in the future where you're projecting technological change. So I will, well, one more slide and then I'll stop. It gets even worse because I'm just talking about people moving from being working to being retired. That's a big effect, but as the population ages, they also become more expensive, of course. So there's healthcare costs and all sorts of other things that you want to take into account. None of that has been in the talk up till now, but it magnifies the same effects I just described. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you. Let's see, I'll get yours. There you are.
Great. All right, thank you, Hal. And before we have any questions, we'll have Jonathan Hall, who's chief economist at Uber, present his talk.
Thank you. And I've been told to plug the Uber happy hour, 7:15, Kimpton Hotel, Palomar, 2 East Jefferson Street. So there will be more beer after the business meeting. Thank you, Hal. As is typical for Discussant, I will have just a random sequence of responses in no particular order, which means if I run out of time, I can just stop anytime, and it'll be just as elegant. And I'm going to bookend this with a couple of Uber things in the middle, a few thoughts that are completely my own. The first is the most boring, in my opinion, which is that there are these GE effects in automation that we've actually thought a little bit about at Uber in the context of automated long-haul trucking. So the idea is, what happens when you automate long-haul trucking? Well, one thing that happens is perhaps long-haul truck driver jobs disappear, and if you don't think anything else changes, then short-haul trucking jobs might just trend up a little bit over time because they were already doing that, and long-haul jobs will go way down. But if you actually build a model of how the fact that long-haul truck driving becomes very cheap in this world, that might actually inspire huge growth in the amount of short-haul trucking that's required, which creates jobs in short-haul trucking. And then, thanks to the beauty of general equilibrium, you have no prediction whatsoever about what will happen to the number of jobs. So it could go way up, it could go way down. The down actually means up in this graph, but it just throws more mud on the story, which is how some people like it. Okay, now the topics that I think are more interesting, and I'm glad actually that Hal particularly likes this 3-day weekend thing, because I do too, and I think we may strongly disagree on this, because I hate 3-day weekends. Not really, but there's this famous Keynes quote that's attributed to Keynes about how everyone will have a 15-hour work week in the future. And it was shockingly hard to find the actual quote from the man himself. The vast majority of people who cite this quote say, productivity is getting high, people will substitute into leisure, they won't have to work as much. But as far as I can tell, if this is the original source material, it's not at all what he was saying. In fact, what he was saying is that the rich don't work very hard, and they don't seem to do anything, and the rest of us should desperately try to avoid being like them, and therefore we're going to have to work because we're not like those people who don't like to work. But in the future, there's only going to be a little lump of labor available, and so we're going to have to agree that we each work only a little bit because there's not enough work to go around, which is really a crazy perspective, but that seems to be what he was actually saying. And none of this has actually borne out at all. And so the graphs that Hal showed ended in 1955 and showed a 38-hour work week, which I think is roughly what we continue to measure up to the present day, despite massive increases in productivity since 1955. And one perspective I have on this is that we're really not measuring work versus leisure, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But I also spent several years of my life thinking very hard about things like conspicuous consumption and what Robert Frank has named positional goods. And I think this is a big part of the story, which is that people don't care about how much they earn or what they consume. They care much more about consuming more than the guy next to them. And that can be actually micro-founded in a very rational economic model in which there's an assortative matching or assortative mating where people are trying to actually impress each other in order to match in one way or another. Most typically, at least in evolutionary biology, this would be literally in the mating market. And so if that's the world you live in, people will continue to work as hard as they possibly can as long as they're producing something with the work that they're doing. And so then there's this next question in the world of automation is what happens to the people who literally can't do anything of value? Because for them, working won't actually improve their chances in the marriage market. And the more automation there is, presumably the more such people there will be in the long run. And then you can think about, well, it'll happen to some people but not others, and there will be inequality. And so what should we think about that, basically? What, will the institution of monogamy disappear as a result of this? And, I could go off in that tangent for a while, but it's probably not a good idea. So then there's this labor force non-participation bent, which is clearly related potentially to the possibility that people can't actually contribute anything to the labor market and thus don't get anything back out of it. Apparently there's something called Fortnite that people like to do. I don't know what it is, but I did read an academic paper about it. And so young men in particular are not working a lot more now than they should. And according at least to this very highly regarded academic paper by Eric Hurst and others, the people who are not employed in this cohort are playing a whole lot more video games. And video games are getting a whole lot better, I am told. So then I started thinking to myself, all right, well, that's interesting. And it seems like that's leisure, like people are doing leisure. But I've also heard that there are all kinds of crazy sort of economic aspects to these fantasy worlds, basically. So there are people who are willing to pay for things in video games with real money, for example. And people are willing to spend a lot of time in these worlds. So perhaps some of this activity is actually labor, not unlike a lot of the other unmeasured sort of household productivity activities that people engage in, particularly on their 3-day weekends when they're driving their kids around in their new minivan instead of doing anything particularly fun. Not that that would ever happen to me. So then this particularly crazy thought occurred to me, which is maybe video games are worlds in which people who can't otherwise be productive can pretend to be productive, and that would fit back into Keynes's view of the world, that people need to at least think that they're doing something and spread work around. So maybe video games are actually fake work that people have to do. And then I thought, well, if that's true, are there any examples of leisure at all? Maybe everything is just work because everybody's in this assortative matching game all the time. And all I could come up with was that there are certain kinds of narcotic experiences that are not impressive at all to other people and are purely leisure activities, which is not really the case of Soma in Brave New World, but see Huxley for more on that. And then back to Uber, and truly my passion in my work is about the organization of work. And technology has a big part to play in this. So if you're an Uber driver, you can use the app to work whenever you want. You can turn it on and turn it off as long as you're not in the middle of a ride. We wouldn't advise turning it off in that state. But otherwise, you can stop working whenever you want. And that's unusual and desirable for a couple of reasons. One is that it's incredibly flexible. You can work whenever you want. And the second is you don't really have a boss, and having a boss tell you what to do is kind of unpleasant and generally undesirable, all else equal. But why is this a thing for driving, but not for a lot of other pieces of the economy? And can we think through a little bit how automation and technology might change the balance here? Okay, so in driving, there are a couple of things that make it very simple and very easy to organize in this way. One is that it's not a team sport, and that's a downside in that a driver doesn't have a lot of colleagues to hang out with, but it's an upside in that you can never take credit for somebody else's work. It's always obvious that you perform this task, and we can reward you for doing that. There's no question of who on the team was responsible for what percentage of the output, and that's really important in asymmetric information settings. And then as well, it's pretty easy by the standards of work to condition your payment on the service provision. And so simply by saying you'll only be paid if you do the work, we obviate the need for any kind of monitoring and bossing you around based on sort of metrics and measures that aren't exactly producing services to the end customer, which is how most jobs end up having to work. I can connect this very, very quickly to the aging workforce, which was a theme in Hal's talk. That there are a considerable number of older people using Uber as an opportunity to earn, and they use it in a very different way from other people. And so this kind of technology for unlocking work by making it super flexible may actually unlock work amongst the demographics that are currently exiting the workforce because of their age. So is this Uber-style model of independent work, is it the future in the automated world? Well, it really depends, like everything. Think about it at the task level, like Hal did. What happens to non-automated tasks in the world where a lot of other tasks are automated? If the remaining tasks that people are better at become shorter, less dependent on team production, easier to do in small chunks on command, then you can imagine that in the future more and more work will be distributed this way. Or perhaps the opposite will happen, and technology will actually move us in the direction of more monitoring of complicated team-based tasks. I don't have a strong opinion on this other than a hope that it's the former rather than the latter. And then in conclusion, I think what Uber has taught us is that this kind of thing can happen real fast. In specifically the ground passenger transportation sector, the number of people working in a different way has just suddenly exploded. It hasn't happened in a bunch of other sectors, but out of nowhere, it happened in like a couple of years to one industry, so we should expect rapid and interesting and surprising change going forward. Thank you.
I wanted to start by just offering Hal a chance to respond, and in case Hal needs a prompt, I seriously doubt that he does, but one of the ones that I thought would be useful to hear from you on is distributional effects and inequality, since you didn't comment on that as much in your talk.
Yes. So I want to say one or two words about Uber, because of course, as an economist, I've watched its development. And I think one thing that is very clear is there are a large number of people out there who want flexible work. That is, they may have even, in some cases, I've encountered reasonably steady job, but to supplement that and to add on top or bottom for specific tasks, they really like that. And I think you hit on some examples. We should look for other jobs like this that people could really do as a way of smoothing consumption and other things of that sort. And I think the example of the video game player is a good one, because there are, I'm told, teams of video players who are earning gold, and then they're selling the gold to other people or trading it for other activities so that you can, beat the monster that you're seeing in the next frame. And the Dutch example is really an interesting one. What happened is they had a recession back in the 80s, and they decided to use the German approach of work sharing. So instead of laying off 10% of the workforce, you can say everybody should work 10% less. Okay, that's a different model than what we've used, but it was quite an attractive model, and it works well for Germany. It worked well for the Netherlands. And then when the recession was over, they said, okay, now we're going to go back to the 5-day week, and said, no, we like this 29-hour work week. So you could reorganize society in that way to have the flexibility of work that is clearly desired and still maintain a high standard of living. And if the labor force is really scarce, if it's really hard to find workers, then employers would be more accommodating. So that, I think, is the positive scenario. The distributional effect, I think it comes down to this point about if you're raising all boats, so you're increasing the wage, which is what we think will happen when you have a scarcity of labor, then I would say it's good to make everybody better off, and I wouldn't let distributional error issues get in the way. Great example from economic history, the Black Death. 30% of the European population died. I like to say it was a great time to be alive if you were alive. Because wages went way up, the feudalism became much more flexible, everything just was fantastic for the workers. It took about a century for them to get back to being oppressed again. But you could have this situation where the slower labor force is going to lead to higher wages.
Okay, I think with that, I'll open up to the audience and we take a couple of questions. Yeah, Ilya.
Idea of the great hollowing out and the economics of superstars that's going to just be amplified by technology. And you could say also there are economies of scale for people against the division of labor. Like for somebody like you, it doesn't make sense to work 20 hours a week or retire at age 50 because, for lots of people, they accumulated the knowledge that they will use. So, you would expect that that what will happen will be a few superstars who will work 50 or 8 hours a week, and most other people will play video games. And so, what do you say about that scenario?
Remember, a lot of really wealthy people are the actors and actresses and sports stars and all these other people who have some special skill or special training or special capabilities that people don't have. And I think that not everyone has. And so I think you would see those people continue to do very well or even better in this world where you have sort of higher wages across the board.
Well, the thing that I find very interesting about this is there are two things. One is if in the superstar world, how jealous are other people of the superstars and how much of a problem is that? And how much of the assortative matching game do they get to take on entirely to themselves? And then the second is, what do they consume, if anything, with their enormous wealth, and what of it just actually sort of dissipates back into society? Because if you look at the way most rich people behave, they don't actually destroy very much stuff. And so, but nobody seems to care about that for some reason. So these two things are at complete odds with each other.
Other questions in the audience? Anybody wants to get their beer? I'm just going to ask one question, I think, that's a little bit more EC-centric. I guess, Jonathan, I'll start with you on this one and then ask Hal as well. But the effect that you were talking about, the kind of Uber model, depends on technological intermediation, having the possibility of a platform. To what extent?
Sorry, the possibility?
Depends on technological intermediation through a platform. That was something I guess neither of you, other than this comment at the very end about Uber, neither of you commented very much on the role that technological intermediation will play in sort of how tight the labor market really is. So I'll leave it as an open-ended thing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role that platforms would play in the labor market.
Sure. Well, so my big question about this is, will platforms become more and more like capitalist economies where the technology simply looks at the supply side and the demand side in a two-sided case and sets prices and sets more and more fine-grained prices? Or instead, will it become more command and control and try to understand everybody's preferences and then make decisions? The latter world looks more like what we call a traditional employment world, in which the algorithm becomes more like a boss, whereas the former world is kind of more like independent work, where people just make choices based on prices. Either way, I think like price discovery or matching technology is clearly going to continue to increase as the way that both labor and other markets are made sense of.
So 10 years ago, I gave a plenary like this at the annual economics event, and I talked about computer-mediated transactions. Buzzword has never caught on, but I like it. The idea is there's a computer in the middle of most economic transactions. Okay, so what does that entail? What does that allow you to do that you couldn't do before? And there were 4 things I said: data extraction and analysis. Everybody knows that, big data. Next one was personalization, customization. Everybody understands that too. Experimentation, well, now the rest of the world is just catching on to this idea that, gosh, when you have these big platforms, you can run continual experiments and get this kind of continuous improvement in the quality by doing that. But the last one is most relevant to your question, and that is contractual innovation, making better contracts. Because what's a contract? Contract says, if I do this, you do that, okay? There's a story about Abraham Lincoln that he was handed a hot beverage. He said, "Madam, if this is coffee, please give me tea. If this is tea, please give me coffee." So it's one of those things. A contract he wasn't fulfilled. I give you $2 and you give me a cappuccino. That's as simple as contract. But what's nice now, when you have a computer in the middle of all these contracts, then in fact you can condition behavior on many more observable aspects of behavior than you could before. So I'll give you one example from Google. What was an ad? In the old days, an ad was, you give me some money, I'll put this ad where people could see it, and some of them might come to your store. That was the contract, roughly. But now what's a contract? Contract is, I'll put this ad where people can see it, and you only have to pay me if they come to your store, if they click on the ad, okay? So that's a different contract. It's a very popular contract. Both sides of the market are better off because of that. And there are many things you can think about that take that form, where you can do contracts, commitments that you couldn't really do before because you didn't have the monitoring technology to do it.
Yes, I think we have time for one more question, and Nicole's the chair. So.
Thanks for your insightful comments. I was curious in the spirit of questions that are relevant to the EC community about something that Jonathan touched on, which is that the reason that Uber can be successful is because it's not like a team job. And I'm wondering if either of you think that with the thickening of labor markets and this intermediation by computers, as Hal would say, if we can construct combinatorial solutions efficiently enough, or if there's some like economic constraint that prevents us from having this kind of work.
That's a great question. And you can see this happening in manufacturing, where the auto companies, to pick the prime example, they have all these suppliers. And the suppliers, this one makes brakes, and this one makes windshields, or this one makes seats, and all this stuff. And the final assembly is putting together these partially assembled parts. So in a way, it is a little bit like these suppliers are like the drivers to some extent, because what they are doing is isolated from what everything else is happening. It's just they're contributing their piece to building the final product. And I think the question, as you get more and more technological capabilities that allows you to improve the efficiency of some of these tasks, you have to think about how work is going to be rearranged. Just like the elevator operator, only in a much bigger deal. All right, thank you.
I think let's wrap up there. Thank you both.